Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. And today's daf is daf Yudches. And some of this daf is pretty straightforward. Other parts are a bit more challenging because we don't always know exactly, where the point of Shechita is. And there's a lot of nuances of biology here. In any event, what we had here on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis is a sugya about pgima, and pgima means when you have nicks, and that applies both to the Korban Pesach, where the Torah prohibits breaking the bone of the Pesach, or for example, with regard to mumim in a bechor, and there was a pgima, there was a certain nick or notch in the ear, and then there's a pguma in all of Kodshim, and then a pagima in a sakin, in a knife for shchita. And the Gemara says that the size of the pagima, which nullifies in a case of pagima of any of the above, is kama pagimas mizbeach, is equal to a notch that would passel the mizbeach. And that's kadesha tachbor ba tziporet. Now this is, if you take this literally, it's almost impossible to imagine that on the entire Mizbeach, which was 10 amos high, you wouldn't find any point on the Mizbeach where if you would move your fingernail, it wouldn't catch on something. Basically, so the Gemara quotes a brayso. This is Kama Pekimas Mizbeach, Rabbi Yochanan ben Rav Sheba Yochai Omer Tefach, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer Kezayis. Now this is a lot more feasible and understandable. You could talk about a certain notch that's as large as a tefach or a kezayis. So what do we do with the first brisa that says that it's kedesha tachbar bo'etz tziporin, lo kasha ha besida ha avna? So the avne mizbeach, which are the stones, were connected to each other with something called sid, which is in English called lime. And with regard to the stones themselves have to be smooth. But with regard to the sid that connected the stones together, then that would break up the square smooth nature of the mizbeach, but only if it was a major kind of a notch that was either the size of a tefach or the size of a kezayis. Now, there's a discussion here in the Rashba about why we should differentiate between the sid and the avonim themselves. But the bottom line is that cracks on the stones of the Mizbeach are intolerable, and they undermine the kashrus of the Mizbeach, the validity of the Mizbeach, because the stones have to be perfectly whole. Just to tell you a quick story, when I was a youngster studying in the class of Rabbi Soloveitchik, there was a whole scandal about tefillin, that apparently when they stretch the hides of the tefillin and then they have to make it into a square, because tefillin have to be squared, and we derive that from an equation to the Mizbeach. There was a scandal about one of the batim machers that in order to create a square, they would put glue in to fill in the areas between the various batim, And I remember distinctly that we brought a pair of tefillin to Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he was, uh, and we asked him about this fill-in from the glue, and he was reviewing in his mind the laws of the Mizbeach, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. We were asking about tefillin, not about Mizbeach. But apparently the laws of the Mizbeach really um, project the standard for what's considered perfectly whole and square. Anyway, so now we basically start the daf for today, and the Gemara is going to now analyze the case of a shochet who violated the laws of shchita and the requirement of being checked, that the knife has to be checked by the chacham, by the local authority of the rabbi, local authority. Omer Rav Huna, Hai tavcha de lo sor sakina kame chacham. We're going to penalize a shochet who doesn't show his knife. Now, I'm not sure if it's on a daily basis, but let's say it's on a daily basis to the chacham. And mishamtinadle, we put him into shamta. Shamta is a kind of an excommunication. Rava Omar. By the way, this is the first time I found a typo in the art scroll. I want to write them a letter here. Anyway, Rava Omar, Ma'abrinyan Le. It's not enough that we put him into Shamta, but we have to remove his status in such a way that he can no longer be a shochet. Now let's just add the following. Shchita is what's called a minui kahal, which means he's appointed and accepted by the community. Without that minui, without that designation, he has no right to slaughter meat, and we cannot accept his shchita. So therefore, this shochet, at the time of Rav Huna, who was guilty of refusing to show his knife to the local chacham, Rava said, not only do we put him into shamta, that's not sufficient of a punishment, of a penalty, but rather we have to completely undermine his minui kol and remove him from his position as a shochet. Umachrizin abisra de trefi. We let out a call that everybody should know that any meat that he slaughters is treif. Velo pligi. Now, this Gemara that we're about to learn makes a fundamental distinction between one case in which the shochet was guilty of not exhibiting, I'll use that word, of not exhibiting the proper respect to the chacham, as opposed to another more extreme case where the shochet was guilty of shechting with a knife that's not kosher for shechita. And that's going to be the difference between Rav Huna and Rava. Kan, when Rav Huna said that all we have to do is put a ban on him, that has to do with the laws of Hilchas Talmud Torah. Now, one of the underlying common denominators that apply to all those cases where you chayav a shamta is for disrespect of a Talmud Chacham. But Nimtzei Sakino Yofa, Rav Huna was talking about a case where we found later on, after we checked the knife that he used, this shochet used to shech, that it was kosher. It had no pgimos. So therefore, we don't have to go ahead a step further and get rid of him status and now announce that all his shchitas are possible, because at the end of the day, he didn't really do anything wrong from the perspective of Hilchas Shchita. His shchita was implemented with a perfectly kosher knife, but his guilt and the worthiness of a penalty is because of Hilchas Talmud Torah, meaning the laws of Kvod Chachamim. But Khan, when Rava went ahead and removed him from his position and declared and announced for the entire public that his shchita is treif, is b'shalom nimtzeis sakino yofa, which means one of two things. Either they never got a chance to check out his knife, or, and this is the way it seems that the Rambam learns, that they checked out his knife and they found it to be pogum. So he actually shechted with a non-kosher knife, and he made the animal nevela. Ravina Omar, if we're talking about a case where he shechted with a non-kosher knife, a knife that was full of notches and pgimos, then we should go even a step further, because we don't want him to benefit. We're going to upgrade the penalty. We don't want him to benefit in any way from his shechita, meaning he's going to sell the meat. The Jewish people are not going to buy the meat because, as Rav already established, we're going to publicize the fact that his meat is treif. But the Goyim will buy it from him. They don't care about shechita. So what are we going to do? We're going to go a step further and penalize him for his terrible actions. And I told you the story about my father in Bangor, Maine. And we're going to declare that we have to do something to make it impossible for him, the shochet, to sell his meat, the carcasses, to goyim. So what are we going to do? Heicha delo nimtzeis psakin yofa memasmes le beparta. Like the word memasmes means to smear something. We're going to smear his meat with excrement. Even the goyim will not buy his meat. It's kind of like flagellating this shochet. And a story about Ahu Tavcha de lo Sar Sakina Kami de Rav Bar Chinina. So Rav Bar Chinina implemented what we saw in Rav Huna early, that since this shochet did not show his knife to the Chacham, we put him into this kind of excommunication called the Shamta. And now, as a result, Achraz Abisra de Trefehi. Now, here it seems that it wasn't that we checked out his knife and we found that it was completely invalid and it was full of notches, but simply he was guilty of disrespect to the local chacham by not showing the chacham the knife to be checked. And in such a case, therefore, we would say that we didn't check out his knife yet. So it could very well be that his knife was kosher. But Rava Bar Chinina took that extreme response to this disrespect of the shochet and declared Achris Abisa the Trefi, notified the people publicly that you cannot eat from his meat. Then Rava Bar Chinina realized that he had gone too far. And what does he do? Iklu Marzutra Varvashiga Bey, when two of the great Amoraim came to visit Rava Bar Chinina, Amalahu, he said to them, look, I'm in a bind. I publicly announced that you can't eat from his meat. And la'ayli rabbanim b'milsei detoli beitafle. What I want you to do for me, I can't do this myself because I was the one who announced that his meat is treif. But what you could do is you could check out his knife. And if you find that indeed his knife is kosher, then at that point you could rescind the shamta, the excommunication, and notify the public that you could allow. And why am I so motivated to do so? Why am I feeling like compassion for this disrespectful shochet? Is because the young children need to eat meat. And as a result of the fact that I declared that you can't eat his meat and his meat is all treif, the children are being denied meat and they need it for their health purposes. So do me a favor, and maybe you'll find after you check out his knife that his knife is indeed kosher. And that's exactly what happened. Bodka Rav Ashi Sakine Nimtzes Yafa V'ach Shari. So when Rav Ashi went out and he was together, if you remember, with Mar Zutra, and he went out and he checked the knife out from this person who was excommunicated, and he found that it was a kosher knife. Then achshere means he gave him the authority to go ahead and continue his practice of shechita as he did before. Amalei Mar Zutra lechish mar l'saba. Saba is considered the elder in town, who is Rabbi Bar Chinina, and now, you going ahead and reinstating this shochet against the original, undermining the original excommunication of the Saba, the great Rabbi Bar Chinina, Amalei Shlichusa Kavdina. We're in fact doing exactly what Rabbi Bar Chinina wanted us to do. We're actually fulfilling his will because he was the one who said, "Do me a favor, and maybe you could be machshir him by checking out his snai." Omar Rava Bar Huna. Okay, now we begin to discuss various categories, and this is going to come up over and over again. In fact, we're going to have discussions about various kinds of pegimos in the sakim. Shein tlusha v'tziporin tlusha muto lishchot ba l'chatchila. Now, what we're learning now in the name of Rabbah is a contradiction to what we learned in the Mishnah. And the Gemara is going to have to somehow reconcile Rabbah with the Mishnah, because Rabbah is saying that if you take a tooth out of, let's say, an animal, and it's very sharp, the law is, let me give the general rule, and then we'll get down to the specifics, the exceptions to the rule. But the general rule is that anything that's very sharp, it could be a broken shard of a knife of a piece of glass, but it has a sharp point, can be used to do shchita. Or in this case, it's tziporin. Let's say you take a nail out of an animal or even a human being, and it has a pointed end to it, then you could use it for shechita. So the Gemara says, but what about our Mishnah? But our Mishnah says that there are certain exceptions, and there are things that cannot be used as a shechita knife, and that's mimagel kotzir. Now the word kotzir here means to harvest, miloshon ktsira, and magel is a sickle. And the sickle, of course, was used to harvest the wheat. Now, a sickle is like a saw, right? It has these, like triangles that go up and down. And that's unacceptable. Hamagera, and on the list in our Mishnah, is any sort of a saw, which is called a magera, or shinayim, or tziporin. So you see clearly that the Mishnah disqualifies the use of a nail or a tooth. Because they don't really cut, they just sort of like pull the pipes out. So Gemara says, Shein Hashem lo kasha. There's no stira between Rabbah, who was machshir shchein, and the Mishnah that apostle shchein, because ha b'chada ha b'tarte. If you put two teeth together, then that's like a knife that has a pagima that goes all the way down. It's like an inverted V. And tziporna lo kasha, ha betlusha, ha b'mechuberes. Now we had, back 2 days ago, or maybe 3 days ago, we had Rebbe Shita, that anything that's attached, which is called mechubar, is completely disqualified for shechita. So now what we're going to say is our Mishnah is talking about mechuberes, talking about the nail that's still attached to the body. And if it's still attached to the body, it has a din of mechubar, and that's why the Mishnah disqualifies that shechita. But if you pull out the nail, and it's now totally tolush, it's detached, then in fact, since it has a sharp edge, it can be used for a kosher shechita. That leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Yud Ches. Now, there's a connection here between the previous Mishnah about a magol, right, which we said was a harvesting sickle, and it's possible for shchita. And the Mishnah says there are exceptions to that rule. For example, Hashochi b'magol kotzir b'derech hiluchasa. Right, we said before that the sickle has like teeth to it, right? Those inverted V's. However, let's say b'derech halichasa, he only uses the sickle in one direction. He doesn't pull it back and forth. So because of the shape of these teeth of the sickle, if he just moves it forward, then the sharp blade of the knife will cut the two pipes, the veshet and the kana, without ripping them out. And technically, according to Torah law, that would be a valid shechita. But if, on the other hand, instead of simply moving the magol forward, he moves the magol backwards in such a way that the pipes of the animal get caught up in these teeth, that would be posel doraisa. So Beit Shammai say that even though on a Torah level, since he only did the shechita in one direction, which means that the knife cut the two simonim, and therefore min Torah it's kosher, but nevertheless we're going to posel it because we're always afraid that if you let him and instruct him to do it in a forward direction, he'll be tempted to do it the way normally shechita is done with a perfectly good knife in the opposite direction, pulling it towards him, which would be a psul doraisa. Ubeis Hillel machshirin. Now we don't know exactly what the word machshirin means, because if Beis Hillel are indeed validating this shechita when it was b'derech halichasa, then they should have said, the Mishnah should have said Beis Hillel matirim. The word machshirin can be used very often in the context of tuma v'tara. Lahachshir is something that could be posel and tame. So we'll get into that in just a minute. We'll come back to that. And then the Mishnah completes itself by saying, V'im hechliku shineha, then harehi sakin kshera. He could take out the pgimos. In other words, even though you had a knife that was a sickle with these teeth, which cannot be used for shechita, but nevertheless, if you sharpen the knife and flatten out these teeth, then it's kosher. Don't think that the sakin is an object like a chefza de kedusha that once you passel it, you can never be machshir. All you have to do is sharpen the knife, and it becomes kosher. Anyway, Omer Abchia bar Ab, Omer Rab Yochanan, Af shehechshiru Beis Hillel. We misunderstood Beis Hillel if we thought that Beis Hillel was allowing you to eat the meat again, right? Against Beit Shammai. No, lo hechshiru l'tara v'dei nevela v'bachila asura. Beis Hillel agrees fundamentally to Beit Shammai's position that the Rabbanan are afraid that if you do with this sickle, you do it b'derech hilucha, you'll do it also what's called molochu mevi. Mevi means when he brings it towards him, and they passel the shechita, but they didn't go a step further according to Beis Hillel, the way Rabbi Yochanan, and determine that and establish that the meat is nevela. Nevela is mitame b'maga. B'masa. If you carry the nevela, that far they didn't go. Now this has to do with another principle which is not here discussed, and that's called ribui tuma lomar bina. We don't like to expand tuma. We want to, leave things as they are, betara. So Rav Ashi Dekanami Tony, I'm going to support this view of Rabbi Yochanan in interpreting Beis Hillel based on the language of the Mishnah. Beis Shammai posum Beis Hillel machshirin. I don't get it. Lo Ketani Beis Shammai osur Beis Hillel matirin. If the machlokus between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is whether you can eat the meat, then it's a question of heter or iser. So Beis Shammai should have said it's also to eat the meat, and Beis Hillel would say no, you're allowed mutter to eat the meat. But instead, the Mishnah uses the language of machshirin and poslim, which might be interpreted or likely should be interpreted as referring to either Tumah V'Tara. So the Gemara rejects this as well. The Gemara says the Taimech, according to the diuk, the interpretation of the words of the Mishnah of Rav Ashi, then listening, it should have said Beis Hillel Beis Shammai Mitam, Beis Hillel Mitarin. Now it's the classic language here. If you're only focused on Tumah V'Tara, meaning whether or not this nevela has a full-fledged status of nevela to be Matami V'Masa, then you should have said Matamim and Mitari. So the language of the Mishnah of Machshirin and Poslim is like down the middle. We say in Yiddish, Nishtaher, Nishtahin. It's not clear in one direction or the other. Are we talking about Tumah V'Tara? But then it should have said Mitamim or Mitarin. Or are we talking about Isa V'Heta? Then it should have said Matirin and Osir. So therefore the Gemara says, you know what? Don't bring any proof to Rabbi Yochanan from the fact that it doesn't say Matirin and Osir and Matirin, because it doesn't say Mitamim and Mitarin either. Ella, therefore, we could go against Rabbi Yochanan. We could say posel machshirin v'osin matir chada milsehi. In other words, the language of posel and machshirin is the same, identical as osur matirin. Then at posel it means we pasel the shchita, and then it's osur to eat the meat. And machshirin in the Mishnah means that we're machshir the shchita, and we validate the shchita as a valid shchita, and therefore we eat the meat. So at the end of the day, we really don't have any proof to support Rabbi Yochanan, because the diuk of Rav Ashi is not foolproof, and you really don't have any proof from the fact that it doesn't say Matirin and Osir. And therefore we're open to the possibility, against Rabbi Yochanan, of assuming that Beis Hillel went a step further and allowed you to eat the meat. And basically we end the Mishnah here because we don't have any definite conclusion, but keep in mind that Rabbi Yochanan said what he said. And Rashi points out that maybe Rabbi Yochanan had such a Kabbalah, meaning he didn't see it in the Mishnah, because the diuk in the Mishnah could go one way or the other. It's not foolproof. But he had a Kabbalah that even Beis Hillel would aser eating the meat. And Beis Hillel was only limiting the law of Tumah V'Tara. Hashochet, now we get to the most challenging part of today's daf. And, I could only do what I can do. I try to do the best I can here because I need a quick lesson in biology here. But we'll try. Hashochet mitoch tabas. Okay. The subject of this Mishnah about Shechita is one of the 5 psulei Shechita, is called Hagrama. Hagrama means, let me introduce it in the following way, that there's a certain part of the trachea which has to be shechted. And the trachea is made of many, many different parts. If the knife is, let's say, cut on an angle, he may end up severing parts that are, let's say, forward, that closer to the to the neck of the animal, and it's outside of the realm of shechita. In other words, when I call it the realm of shechita, I'm talking about a certain location in the trachea where you have to shecht it. If you go beyond that, then the animal becomes a treifa, because that's not shechita, and the animal will die because of the place that you cut. So the subject of our Mishnah is, what is the, shall we call it, the circumference of the area which has to be cut, such that if you go beyond that circumference, that's called hagrama, and the animal's treif. And the Mishnah records a machlokas here between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. And this machlokas deals with a part of the trachea that's above the tabas. Now, the word tabas, which literally means a ring, really in our Mishnah is talking about a tabas hagedola. There are many different rings that make up the trachea. And as you go up, so to speak, closer to the neck, you're outside of the circumference of shechita, and the slaughtering is invalid. So as long as you stay within the tabas, and again, we're talking about tabas hagedola, which he says in biological terms is called the creasoid cartilage, which again, I have to admit that these words are meaningless to me, but he has a little bit of a diagram, and it's called the tabas hagedola because it's a ring that goes all around the trachea, as opposed to the other tabos, which are in a horseshoe shape that have a certain opening to them. So you can't go beyond the tabas hagedola, because if you do so, then the shechita is possible, and it's called hagrama. However, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient, and one second, I skipped a little bit. Let me backtrack. V'shir ba melo hachut al pnei kula shchitas kshera. So the Tanakama says that if you go beyond the tabas hagedola, then what did you do? Did you cut the other tabos, completely severing them, or did you leave at least part of them? The Mishnah used the word melo hachut, which is a handbreadth, meaning a small amount that was not cut. And Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, melo chut al pnei ruba. Just one second. Right. So again, let's go over it one more time. According to Tanakama L'Chumra, the only time we can salvage the shechita and we could determine that it's not hagrama is what's called al pnei kula, meaning you have to leave a malo machat in those extra tabos when he went too far with a slanted knife, if it's al pnei kula, which means along the entire circumference of those tabos, beyond the tabos agdol. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says, no. All you have to do is leave behind, uncut, a malo hachut, but it doesn't have to be al pnei kula. It's enough it's al pnei ruba. So if it's al pnei ruba, then we have halacha, says Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, of azlin and basa ruba, and it's as if you had left uncut the entire tabas, that tabas which is a hagrama tabas, which is called tabas. Again, I think it's near the futi. I don't know. He says here, I'll just read to you. He says the lower bands of cartilage are also called tabos. His shchita is valid if he cut through the entire ring without going above it, thus leaving over a sliver of the ring on the side of the incision that is towards the head. If, however, he deviated and inclined the knife so that he completely severed the trachea above the great ring, and I emphasize that word above the great ring, that's called hagroma. Now, even though most of the trachea was cut within the prescribed area, the shechita is invalid since the completion of the shechita went beyond that area. Unless, according to the view of the Tanakama, he left a handbreadth along its entire circumference. Whereas according to Rabbi Yossi, the shechita is valid even if he did not complete the severing of the trachea within the ring. He went beyond the trachea, but he severed the greater part of it within the ring, thus leaving over towards the head a sliver of the greater part of the ring's circumference. So the Gemara says the following: Rav u'Shmuel di'amrit shavayu halacha k'Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to be mekil, and we're going to rely on Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Af Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda, even though we're going to accept Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda, says Rav and Shmuel, but nevertheless, lo omer ela b'tabas gedola, which means that the tabas gedola, which we called the creasoid cartilage, is still within the bounds of the shechita. And why? What's so special about that area of the trachea? Because hoil umakefes is kol hakana, right? It surrounds the entire trachea. Avol b'shar tabos, but with regard to other rings, which are beyond that tabas gedola, lo, we're not going to accept Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. So Gemara says, what are you talking about? Uveshar tabos lo. For Asani, we have a brisa that says that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer Hashochi b'shar tabos afal pishenim makifos is akol akana makifos is rova akana shchitosik sheira. That even the smaller tabos have the same status as the large tabos, according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. And if you shech the smaller tabos, that's not hagrom, it doesn't pass the shchita. The reason for that is because those tabos, although they're not as profound as the tabos gedola to completely encircle the trachea, but they do encircle most of the trachea. And that's called makifos is rov hakana. So again, keep in mind, we're talking about the trachea, not the esophagus, but and therefore, since it's makifos as rov, then the Torah has a principle called rubo kekulo. So again, we're not talking now at this point about how much of the ring he actually severed and applying rov kekulo to that, but rather we're talking about the area that's included within the area of shechita, the circumference that's allowed for shechita. And we're now saying that according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, we can expand that circumference to allow for a greater area for shechita, to include even the smaller tabos, shar tabos, in the language of the Gemara here, because even though they're not makifos as kol haveshet, but nevertheless they're makifos rov haveshet.